Her parents sold her like cattle. Cast aside as a burden, Clara found herself alone in the outback, until an Aboriginal man and his 3 children showed her that true family is not about blood, but about who sees your worth. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Clara Whitmore's bedroom, casting pale rectangles across the floorboards. She lay still beneath her blanket, listening to sounds that were wrong, too quiet. No clatter of breakfast preparations, no murmured conversation between her parents, only the distant call of a kookaburra, mocking and hollow in the stillness. Clara was 17 years old, and she had learned to read the silences in her family's modest home in rural New South Wales. There were comfortable silences of shared evening tea, tense silences that followed her father's drinking, and brittle silences that preceded bad news. This silence was different. This silence felt like an ending. She pushed herself upright and noticed the absence immediately. Her small travel case, the one her grandmother had given her before passing 3 winters ago, sat packed beside her bedroom door. The leather straps were buckled. The brass clasps gleamed. No one had asked her to pack. Her hands trembled as she dressed, pulling on her cream-colored dress with the modest embroidered neckline. Some instinct told her she would need it. When she emerged into the main room, she found her mother, Margaret, standing at the window with her back turned. Her father, Harold, sat at the table with his hat already on his head, staring at a spot on the wall. "Good morning," Clara offered, her voice small. Neither parent responded. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Mum?" Clara tried again. "What is happening?" Margaret Whitmore did not turn. Harold scraped his chair back and stood, still not meeting his daughter's eyes. "Get your case," he said. "We are leaving in 10 minutes. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not literally, though sometimes the earth did move out here in this dry country. No, this was a different kind of shifting, the kind that changed the shape of one's life. The cart journey took 3 hours. They traveled west, deeper into the vast interior where properties grew larger and neighbors grew scarcer. Clara sat in the back with her case, watching the landscape unfold. Ghost gums rose pale against the blue sky. Red-tailed black cockatoos wheeled overhead, their calls sharp and mournful. The earth beneath the cartwheels changed from brown to ochre to deep rust. Her parents sat in front, their backs rigid, their conversation non-existent. Twice Clara saw her mother's hand reach toward Harold's arm, and twice she watched her withdraw it. Whatever was happening, they had agreed upon it. Without her, the realization struck Clara like a physical blow. She was not traveling with her family. She was being delivered somewhere, the packed case, the terrible silence. These were preparations for a departure. "Please," Clara said, her voice cracking. "Please tell me what I have done wrong." Margaret made a small wounded noise that might have been a sob, but still she did not turn. Harold snapped the reins, urging the horse faster, as though speed could outrun the weight of what they were doing. The Burrows property announced itself with a weathered sign bearing the name Willow Bend Station. Beyond the gate, a long dirt track wound through paddocks where cattle grazed. The homestead was substantial, a sprawling structure of stone and timber that spoke of prosperity. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, their corrugated iron roofs glinting in the afternoon sun. A man stood waiting on the veranda, Graham Burrows. Clara knew him by reputation only. A grazier of considerable means, a widower of 4 years, known for his exacting standards and cold demeanor. Harold pulled the cart to a stop and climbed down. Margaret remained seated, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Clara stayed where she was, frozen. "Whitmore," Graham Burrows said, his voice businesslike. "You are on time." "Good." Harold reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a cloth bag. Clara could see the outline of papers inside, her documents, birth certificate, school records. "It is all here," Harold said. "Everything you asked for." Burrows took the bag. "And the girl?" Clara's breath caught. The girl, not Clara. Not even your daughter, as though she were livestock, as though she were a parcel to be collected. "She is in the back," Harold said. He did not turn to look at her. He did not offer farewell or explanation. He simply stood there, completing a transaction, while Clara's world collapsed. "Come here, girl," Burrows called. "Let me have a look at you." Clara's legs felt wooden as she climbed down. She walked toward the veranda with her head high, though every step cost her. She would not cry. She would not beg. Whatever this was, she would face it with dignity. Burrows descended the steps and circled her slowly. his eyes assessing. He examined her hands for calluses. He checked her teeth. He measured her height against his shoulder. Clara stood still through all of it, though her skin crawled with humiliation. "Healthy enough," Burrows pronounced. "Bit thin, but we can fix that. She will do." "It is done then," Harold said, and Clara heard the relief in his voice. Relief. Her own father was relieved to be rid of her. "Please," Clara said, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Why are you doing this? What have I done?" Harold finally turned to look at her. His eyes were not cruel exactly. They were worse than cruel. They were empty, resigned. "We cannot afford to keep you," he said simply. "There is no money for a dowry, no prospects. You are a burden, Clara. Here at least you will have a roof and food." A burden. She was a burden. "Dad," she whispered. "Please." But Harold was already climbing back onto the cart. Margaret still had not turned. The horse stirred and then they were moving, rolling away, leaving her behind in red dust with a stranger's gaze upon her back. Clara might have stood there forever, watching the cart grow smaller until it disappeared, but a sound broke through her paralysis. The creak of wheels, the gentle plod of a horse, the laughter of children. She turned and saw them approaching from the workers' quarters. A cart driven by a man with dark skin and paint markings on his chest in patterns of white ochre. His hair was bound with a woven band, and feathers were tucked into it. Beside him rode 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, their eyes bright with curiosity, their chatter falling silent as they saw Clara standing there with tear tracks cutting pale lines through the dust on her cheeks. The man pulled his cart to a stop. His eyes moved from Clara to Graham Burrows and back again, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something quieter, disapproval perhaps, a judgment rendered in silence. "Caelan," Burrows said, "you have brought the children." "They wanted to see the station," Caelan replied, his voice deep and measured. "We were tracking wallabies near the eastern boundary. Good signs." Burrows grunted. "Fine. Get them settled. There is work to discuss later." But Caelan was not looking at Burrows anymore. He was looking at Clara, and the 3 children were looking at her too. The youngest, a girl with wide dark eyes and a gap-toothed smile, tilted her head. "Are you sad?" the little girl asked. No adult had asked her that question. No adult had acknowledged what was written on her face. But this child had seen her, had really seen her. "Yes," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am very sad." The little girl nodded solemnly. Then she reached into a woven bag and withdrew a feather. Rust-colored and downy, she held it out toward Clara. "This is for you," the girl said. "Feathers help with sad." Clara looked at the offering, looked at the small hand holding it. Such a small thing, such a simple gift. And yet in that moment, surrounded by the vastness of the outback and the weight of her abandonment, it felt like the most precious thing she had ever received. "Thank you," she said. The little girl beamed, and Clara, despite everything, felt the faintest flicker of hope. Behind her, Burrows cleared his throat. The moment was over. Clara belonged to Willowbend Station now. But as she turned to follow her new master toward the house, she tucked the feather carefully into her pocket, close to her heart. She did not yet know Caelan's name, or the names of his children. She did not yet understand the culture from which they came, the ancient connections to country that ran through their blood like rivers through the land. She did not yet know that in this chance encounter, her true journey had just begun. All she knew was that she was not entirely alone, and sometimes that is enough to survive. The first weeks at Willowbend Station taught Clara the true weight of invisibility. Graham Burrows gave orders without looking at her, his commands issued toward the wall or the floor, or the vast empty sky beyond the window. She was to rise before dawn. She was to prepare breakfast. She was to clean the house, tend the vegetable garden, wash the clothes, and make herself useful in whatever capacity was required. She was not to speak unless spoken to. She was not to eat until the family had finished. She was not to expect gratitude. Clara learned quickly. She learned which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them in the early morning darkness. She learned which of Burrows's moods preceded the worst of his temper and how to make herself small when the storm clouds gathered in his eyes. She learned that her value here was measured in work completed and silence maintained, and that anything else she might have been, a daughter, a dreamer, a young woman with hopes, had no place within these walls. But Clara was not entirely alone in the house. Alice Burrows was 15 years old, with her dead mother's gentle features and her father's cautious, watchful eyes. She moved through the homestead like a ghost, performing her duties with mechanical precision, rarely speaking except when necessity demanded it. For the first week, Clara thought the girl simply shared her father's disdain, but on the 8th morning, she discovered otherwise. Clara had risen even earlier than usual, scrubbing the stone kitchen floor on her hands and knees when she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned to find Alice standing in the doorway, a folded cloth in her hands. "Here," Alice whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though expecting her father to materialize from the shadows. "For your hands." Clara looked down at her own fingers, red and raw from lye soap and cold water. She had not even noticed the pain anymore. It had become as constant as breathing. "Thank you," Clara said, accepting the cloth. It was soft cotton, neatly hemmed. Alice nodded once, quickly, then slipped away before Clara could say anything more. It was a small kindness, a dangerous one, given the household hierarchy. But that single gesture cracked something open in Clara's chest, a reminder that compassion could survive even in the most inhospitable soil. She tucked the cloth into her apron pocket, alongside the feather she still carried, and returned to her scrubbing with something that felt almost like renewed strength. The children came every few days with their father. Carlin was the station's primary tracker, responsible for finding lost cattle, reading the signs left by dingoes and feral dogs, and understanding the movements of the land in ways that no white man seemed capable of matching. Burrows needed him, respected him even, though that respect was colored by something darker that made Clara's stomach turn when she witnessed it. Carlin conducted his business with quiet dignity, answering questions directly, and offering his expertise without flourish or apology. His children, Miri, Jindu, and little Nara, often accompanied him, helping with small tasks or simply enjoying the change of scenery from their camp several miles distant. It was Miri, the eldest at 12, who first spoke to Clara properly. She found Clara hanging laundry behind the house, struggling with a sheet that the wind kept snatching from her grasp. "You are doing it wrong," Miri observed, appearing beside her with sudden quiet. Clara startled, nearly losing the sheet entirely. "I beg your pardon." "The wind," Miri explained, taking one corner of the fabric. "You have to work with it, not against it. Like this." She demonstrated, using the wind's force to help spread the sheet across the line, rather than fighting its attempts to steal the fabric away. Within moments, the task that had frustrated Clara for 10 minutes was completed. "Thank you," Clara said, genuinely impressed. "How did you learn that?" Miri shrugged. "Country teaches if you listen." Before Clara could ask what she meant, Jindu appeared, the 9-year-old boy studying Clara with open curiosity. He said something in his own language, a melodic string of syllables, and then attempted to imitate her accent. "Good morning, Miss Clara," he said, drawing out the vowels in exaggerated fashion. "Lovely weather we are having." Miri swatted his arm, but she was smiling, and Clara laughed. The sound surprised her. It felt foreign in her throat, rusty from disuse, but it was real and it was hers. From the veranda, Burrows watched with narrowed eyes. Clara saw him there, saw the disapproval etched into his face. She lowered her head and returned to the laundry with renewed diligence. But the warmth of that small exchange stayed with her through the long afternoon. The trip to the village mercantile was Clara's first excursion beyond the station boundary since her arrival. Burrows had business in town and required someone to carry the purchases. Clara was that someone. The village of Merrywell was small, consisting of a general store, a public house, a blacksmith, and a cluster of modest homes. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were examined with suspicion. What Clara did not expect was to encounter Callan there. He stood outside the mercantile, waiting patiently while the proprietor, a red-faced man named Henderson, served the customers inside. His children were with him, Nara perched on his shoulders, and the older two standing quietly at his side. Something in his expression stopped Clara, something weary, something resigned. She noticed then what she should have seen immediately. Callan was waiting outside because he was not welcome inside. The white customers entered and exited freely, some casting sidelong glances at the Aboriginal family as they passed. Henderson served them through the window, passing goods through a small opening, as though even the air Callan breathed might contaminate the premises. Clara watched as a farmer emerged from the store and walked directly past Callan without acknowledgement. Not even the barest nod one might offer a stranger. It was as though Caelan did not exist, as though he and his children were invisible. The realization struck Clara with physical force. She had known prejudice existed. She had heard the casual cruelty spoken in her parents' home. But she had never witnessed it like this. Never seen a man of obvious skill and dignity reduced to waiting outside while lesser men walked freely through doors he was not permitted to enter. "Come along," Burrows called from behind her, impatient. Clara followed, but something had shifted in her understanding. The prejudice was not abstract. It was concrete, structural, woven into colonial society, and Caelan bore it with a patience that made her heart ache. The storm came 3 weeks into Clara's tenure at Willowbend. It rolled in from the west, a wall of black cloud and distant lightning that turned afternoon into premature dusk. Burrows ordered everyone inside, but in the chaos of securing livestock and battening down outbuildings, no one noticed that Jindu had wandered off. It was Nara who raised the alarm, her small voice cutting through the wind. "Where is Jindu?" Clara saw the terror in Carlin's eyes, a father's terror, primal and absolute. He was across the yard in moments, calling his son's name into the gathering darkness. But Jindu did not answer. Clara did not think. She simply ran. The wind tore at her dress as she sprinted toward the eastern paddock. Rain began to fall, heavy drops that stung her skin and turned the dust to mud beneath her feet. Lightning cracked overhead, close enough that she felt the thunder in her chest. She found him huddled beneath a ghost gum, trembling and crying, too frightened to move. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. "It is all right," she said, pulling him into her arms. "I am here. You are safe." She wrapped herself around him as the storm raged, shielding his small body from the worst of the rain. They stayed there for what felt like hours, until the worst of the thunder passed and the world became something other than chaos. When she looked up, Carlin was standing there. His chest heaved from running. His eyes were wet. From rain or tears she could not tell. He did not speak. He simply knelt beside them and gathered his son into his own embrace, holding the boy with a desperation that needed no translation. Then he looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, nothing more. But the depth of gratitude, the acknowledgement of what she had done, it was the most profound thank you Clara had ever received. Something had changed between them. Something had been built in that storm, in the mud and rain and desperate search for a lost child. She did not know yet what to call it, but she knew it was real. And she knew with sudden certainty that whatever hardships awaited her, she was no longer facing them entirely alone. The cattle had grown restless in the weeks following the storm, as though the violent weather had unsettled something in their blood. Burrows spent long hours in the saddle, driving the mob back toward the safety of the main paddocks, and his temper grew shorter with each passing day. Clara learned to move even more quietly through the homestead, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, to become as invisible as the dust motes that danced in the shafts of afternoon light. It was on such an afternoon that the accident occurred. Clara was in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds from between rows of struggling cabbages, when she heard the commotion. Shouting voices, the thunder of hooves, and then a sound she had never heard before, a man's cry of pain, sharp and terrible in the still air. She ran toward the yards without thinking, arriving in time to see Burrows lying in the dust, where a startled heifer had thrown him from his horse. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and his face had gone the color of old milk. 2 stockmen stood nearby, frozen in shock, while the cattle milled nervously in the holding pen. Clara did not hesitate. She knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her apron to bind the wound where bone had broken through skin. She spoke to him calmly, clearly, directing the stockmen to fetch the cart and blankets, to send word to the doctor in Marywell. She had no training in medicine, but she had watched her grandmother tend injuries on their small farm, and the knowledge rose in her unbidden. Burrows gripped her arm as the stockmen lifted him onto the cart. His eyes, usually so cold, were wild with pain and something that might have been fear. "You did well," he managed through gritted teeth. "You did your duty." Clara nodded, expecting nothing more. And indeed nothing more came. Even in his agony, even with her quick thinking possibly having saved his leg, Burrows could not bring himself to offer genuine thanks. She had done what was expected. That was all. She watched the cart roll toward the homestead, her hands still stained with his blood, and felt something harden in her chest. Not hatred exactly, something colder. the understanding that she would never be more than a tool to this man, never a person deserving of real acknowledgement. That evening, Clara sat on the wooden step outside the kitchen door, watching the sun descend toward the western horizon. The sky blazed with color, ochre and crimson and gold, as though the land itself was burning. Her body ached from the long day, and her mind felt heavy with exhaustion that sleep would not cure. She heard footsteps on the hard-packed earth and looked up to find Caelan approaching. He moved with his characteristic quiet, seeming almost to glide across the ground rather than walk upon it. In his hand he carried 2 small cups carved from wood. "May I sit?" he asked. Clara nodded, shifting to make room on the step. He settled beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel his presence. For a long moment, they simply sat together, watching the colors shift and deepen in the vast sky. "I heard what happened," Caelan said eventually, "with Burrows." "I did what anyone would have done," Clara replied. Caelan made a soft sound that might have been agreement or might have been doubt. He handed her one of the wooden cups. Inside was water, cool and clear. "Drink," he said. "You have earned rest." Clara drank, grateful for the simple kindness. When she lowered the cup, she found Caelan watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You know," he said, "there is a concept my people hold very dear. We call it country. It is not just land, it is everything, the earth, the sky, the waters, the creatures, the spirits of those who came before. Country holds us, and we hold country. We belong to each other." Clara listened, sensing that something important was being shared. "But there is another truth we understand," Caelan continued. "No spirit can grow where it is being constantly crushed. A seed planted in poisoned soil will not flourish, no matter how strong it might have been." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "There is no safe ground where the spirit is being diminished." The words struck Clara with unexpected force. She felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have explained exactly why. Perhaps because someone had finally named what she was experiencing. Perhaps because someone had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time since her parents had driven away. "I do not know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go. No one who wants me." Caelan was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the path forward is not the path we expect. Sometimes we must be willing to walk into the unknown." The following week brought fresh trouble. A section of fencing had collapsed in the eastern paddock, and Burrows, still confined to his bed with his leg bound and splintered, blamed Clara for failing to report the damage. It did not matter that she had never been assigned to inspect the fencing. It did not matter that the collapse had clearly been caused by a fallen tree, victim of the recent storm. Burrows needed someone to blame, and Clara was convenient. He summoned her to his bedside and berated her for 20 minutes, his face red with fury, his words sharp as broken glass. Clara stood with her hands clasped before her, accepting the abuse in silence as she had been trained to do. But something inside her had changed. When he finally paused for breath, she spoke. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I did not damage the fence, and I was not assigned to monitor it. I have worked faithfully every day since my arrival. I have done everything asked of me. I deserve to be treated with basic respect." The silence that followed was absolute. Burrows stared at her as though she had grown a second head. Alice, who had been standing in the corner of the room, drew a sharp breath. "Get out," Burrows said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my sight." Clara went, but she walked with her head held high, and she did not look back. The yard was full of people when Clara emerged from the house. Caelan stood near the water trough, his children clustered around him. Several stock men had gathered nearby, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Alice had followed Clara outside, standing in the shadow of the veranda with her arms wrapped around herself. Caelan stepped forward. His face was calm, but Clara could see the determination in his eyes. "Mr. Burrows," he called, loud enough for his voice to carry through the open window to the bedroom within. "I have a proposition for you." A moment passed. Then Burrows appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden crutch, his face tight with pain and irritation. "What is it, Caelan?" "I am in no mood for games." "No games," Caelan said. "A trade. If Clara wishes it, she can come to work and live with my family. In exchange, I will provide all tracking services for Willowbend Station through the next summer season. without additional payment. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara felt the weight of every gaze upon her. "That is a substantial offer," Burrows said slowly. "Nearly a year of free labor." "Yes," Callan agreed. "It is." Burrows looked at Clara. For a moment something almost like uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Then his expression hardened. "Take her," he said. "She is more trouble than she is worth anyway." Clara felt the words like a slap. More trouble than she is worth. But even as the pain registered, she realized something else. She was free. Callan had offered something of genuine value for her, had seen worth in her that Burrows, that her own parents had never acknowledged. She looked at Callan and his children. Miri was watching her with quiet hope. Jindu was bouncing on his heels with barely contained excitement. And Nara, sweet little Nara, was already reaching for Clara's hand. "Thank you," Clara said. "I would like that very much." Callan nodded once solemnly. Then the smallest smile crossed his face. "Good," he said. "Then let us go home." Clara woke to the sound of bird song, not the harsh cry of crows or the mocking laughter of kookaburras, which had been her morning companions at Willowbend Station. This was something different, a liquid cascade of notes that rose and fell like water over stones, accompanied by the gentle murmur of children's voices and the crackling of a morning fire. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The canvas shelter above her head was unfamiliar, as was the woven mat beneath her body and the coarse woolen blanket that covered her. But the sensation that bloomed in her chest as she opened her eyes was something she recognized from long ago, from a childhood she had nearly forgotten. Peace. She smiled without meaning to. It was the first genuine smile she had worn in months. The camp was modest but well organized, positioned near a bend in a creek that still held water despite the dry season. Several shelters clustered together in the shade of river red gums, their trunks pale and mottled, their branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in supplication. A fire pit occupied the center of the clearing, and beside it sat Maya, Callan's sister, tending the morning flames. Maya was perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. She looked up as Clara emerged from her shelter, and her face softened into welcome. "You slept well," Maya observed. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara admitted, somewhat surprised by her own answer. "Better than I have in a long time." Maya nodded as though this was expected. She patted the ground beside her, inviting Clara to sit, and handed her a cup of tea made from native leaves that Clara could not identify. The flavor was subtle and slightly bitter, but warming. "The land here is good," Maya said. "Old and strong, it holds those who respect it." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, absorbing the warmth. "I do not know very much about this land," she confessed. "About your culture, your ways." "You will learn," Maya said, "if you wish to." "I do wish it. Very much." Maya studied her for a long moment, and something seemed to shift in her assessment. Then she reached out and placed her hand briefly over Clara's. "Good," she said. "Then you are welcome here, sister of my heart's walking." Clara did not fully understand the phrase, but she understood the sentiment behind it. She was being accepted, not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a person worthy of welcome. The realization brought tears to her eyes that she did not try to hide. The days that followed taught Clara what it meant to be part of a community, rather than merely tolerated within one. Miri and Nara took it upon themselves to educate her in the basics of camp life. They showed her which plants could be eaten and which could be used for medicine. They taught her to read the tracks of animals in the red dust, the hopping prints of wallabies, the slithering trails of snakes, the tiny scattered marks of insects. They explained in words she could understand the concept of country, how the land was not simply a resource to be exploited, but a living entity with which all people existed in relationship. "See this tree?" Miri said one afternoon, standing before an ancient river-red gum whose trunk had been scarred by a long-ago bushfire. "It has been here for hundreds of years, maybe longer. It watched our grandparents' grandparents. It holds their stories in its bark." Clara looked at the tree with new eyes. She had seen trees all her life, had climbed them as a child, had sheltered beneath them from rain and sun, but she had never thought of them as witnesses, as holders of memory. "In your culture," Miri continued, "you own the land. In ours, the land owns us. We belong to it. We care for it, and it cares for us." "That is beautiful," Clara said softly. Miri shrugged, but there was pride in her eyes. It is just the way things are. News travelled fast in the bush, carried by stockmen and drovers and the occasional travelling hawker who passed through remote properties with goods to sell and gossip to share. Within weeks, word of Clara's departure from Willowbend Station had spread throughout the district, and the whispers were not kind. Burrows, it seemed, had been telling people that Clara had been taken, stolen perhaps, though he never quite used that word. He implied that Carlin had acted inappropriately, that Clara had been corrupted by proximity to the Aboriginal camp. He painted himself as the victim of an ungrateful servant and an overreaching native. Clara learned of these rumours from Constable Thomas Richards, who arrived at the camp one grey afternoon with questions in his eyes and caution in his bearing. He was a young man, perhaps 30, with a careful manner that suggested he took his duties seriously even when they made him uncomfortable. "Miss Whitmore," he said, standing at a respectful distance from the camp, "I'm obliged to inquire after your welfare." Clara met his gaze directly. "I am well, Constable. Better than I have been in many months." Richards looked around the camp, taking in the modest shelters, the children playing near the creek, Carlin working on some task in the shade of a nearby tree. "You are here of your own choice?" he asked. "I am." "And you wish to remain?" "I do." The constable nodded slowly. His expression was difficult to read, but Clara thought she detected something like relief in it. Perhaps he had expected to find something worse. Perhaps he had dreaded what he might be required to do if the rumours proved true. "Very well," he said. "I will note your statement for the record." He left without further comment, but Clara noticed that his parting nod included Caelan, a small acknowledgement, barely perceptible, but significant in its own way. A fortnight after the constable's visit, a child from a neighbouring property arrived at the camp with a message. He was breathless from running, his face flushed with excitement at the importance of his errand. "For Miss Clara," he said, thrusting a folded piece of paper toward her. "From Miss Alice at Willowbend." Clara's heart stuttered. She had thought of Alice often since leaving the station, had worried about her, had wished she could have said goodbye properly. She took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise, the words chosen with obvious care. "Dear Clara, I hope this letter finds you well. Father does not know I am writing. I wanted you to know that I think of you often, and that I hope you are happy where you are. You were kind to me when kindness was scarce, and I shall not forget it. I miss your presence in the house. Things are quieter now, but not in a good way. Perhaps one day we will meet again under better circumstances." Your friend Alice Clara read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. Such simple words, but they carried such weight. Alice was trapped in that house, just as Clara had been, perhaps more so, bound by blood and duty and the expectations placed upon daughters. The letter was a hand reaching across the divide, a reminder that connection could survive even the most difficult circumstances. She tucked the letter into her pocket, next to the feather and the cloth that Alice had given her all those weeks ago. 3 small tokens of kindness, 3 threads connecting her to a past she was slowly learning to release. That night, sitting beside the fire with Carlan's family around her, Clara felt something settle into place within her chest. Not quite happiness. That would come later, in degrees and measures too subtle to name, but something adjacent to it, something like belonging. Nara crawled into her lap and fell asleep there, warm and trusting. And Clara, holding this small child who had become so dear to her, understood at last what Caelan had meant about country, about spirit, about finding the place where one truly belonged. She was home. The morning began like any other. Mist rose from the creek in silver ribbons as the sun climbed above the tree line, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Clara was helping Nara collect kindling for the morning fire when she heard it, the distant rumble of approaching horses and the creak of cartwheels on hard-packed earth. She straightened, her heart already beginning to race. Something in the quality of the sound told her this was not a casual visit. This was a reckoning. Carlan emerged from his shelter, his expression calm but alert. He moved to stand beside Clara, and his presence steadied her in ways she could not articulate. "Go to the children," he said quietly. "Keep them close." Clara gathered Miri, Jindu and Nara near the largest shelter, positioning herself between them and whatever was approaching. Maya came to stand with her, and the 2 women exchanged a look of shared understanding. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Graham Burrows arrived at the head of a small procession. He was on horseback now, His injured leg healed enough to ride, though his face still carried the pallor of prolonged pain. Behind him came Constable Richards in his official uniform, looking deeply uncomfortable with the situation. A handful of local settlers followed, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. The entourage stopped at the edge of the camp. Burrows surveyed the scene with cold eyes, his gaze lingering on Clara with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Constable," Burrows said, not bothering to dismount. "You see, just as I said, the girl is still here." Richards shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Burrows, as I have explained, Miss Whitmore has already confirmed that she is here of her own free will." "Says free will," Burrows scoffed. "She is a young woman of impressionable character. How can we be certain she has not been coerced, manipulated?" His voice carried easily to the gathered crowd. "These people have their ways, Constable. We all know the stories." Clara felt the children press closer to her. Nara's small hand found hers and gripped tight. "What is it you want, Mr. Burrows?" Carlin asked. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel beneath it. "I want the girl returned to proper care," Burrows said. "She was placed in my household by her parents. She belongs there." "She belongs nowhere she does not wish to be," Kalin replied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the settlers exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in agreement with Burrows's position. Clara could feel the tension building, thick as the morning mist. Constable Richards dismounted and approached Clara directly. His expression was conflicted, but there was a core of decency in his eyes that gave her hope. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, "I must ask you once more for the record and in the presence of witnesses. Are you being held here against your will?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Burrows cut in before she could speak. "Of course she will say no," he snapped. "She has been conditioned, manipulated. I am asking you to see past her words to the truth of the situation." "The truth," Clara said, and her voice came out stronger than she expected, "is that Mr. Burrows treated me as property, as something less than human." She stepped forward, away from the children until she stood in the open space between the camp and the horsemen. "My own parents sold me to him. Sold me, Constable, as though I were a beast to be traded." Richards's expression shifted. Several of the settlers looked uncomfortable. "And here," Clara continued, "here I have been treated with kindness, with respect, with dignity. Carlin and his family saw my worth when no one else would. They offered me a home when I had none." She felt tears threatening but held them back. "If that is manipulation, then I pray the whole world might be so manipulated." Burrows's face had gone red with anger. "This is preposterous. Constable, I demand that you remove this girl from these savages and return her to civilized society." The word savages hung in the air like poison. Clara saw Miri flinch, saw Jindu's hands curl into fists, saw the pain flash across Maya's weathered face. These people, these kind, wise, generous people who had welcomed Clara into their family, reduced to a slur. Carlin stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, did not show anger, but something in his bearing commanded attention. Even Burrows fell silent. "Mr. Burrows," Kalin said, "you speak of civilization as though it is something you own. But I have seen your civilization. I have seen how it treats those it considers lesser. I have seen the cruelty it calls order and the theft it calls progress." He paused, letting his words settle. "Clara came to us broken by your civilization, abandoned by her own blood, sold like cattle, worked like a beast. And you dare to speak of savagery." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses stood still as though they too were listening. "She is free," Kalin said simply. "She has always been free. The only question is whether you are civilized enough to recognize it." For a long moment no one moved. Then Constable Richards cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm going to ask you one final time, and I ask that you answer clearly so that all present can hear. Do you wish to remain here, with this family, of your own free choice?" Clara drew a deep breath. She thought of her parents driving away without a backward glance. She thought of Burrows inspecting her like livestock. She thought of Alice's letter, folded against her heart. She thought of Nara's laughter, and Miri's patience, and Jindu's mischief, and Carlin's quiet wisdom. She stepped forward until she stood directly before the constable, close enough that he could not mistake her words. "I choose to stay," she said. "I choose this family. I choose this life." Richards nodded slowly. Then he turned to face the assembled crowd. "I find no evidence of wrongdoing here," he announced. "Miss Whitmore is a free woman of legal age, and she has made her choice. The matter is closed." Burrows sputtered with rage. "This is outrageous. I will write to the governor. I will—" "You will do as you please, Mr. Burrows," Richards interrupted, "but you will do it elsewhere. Good day." The settlers departed in ones and twos, most of them seeming relieved to be away from the confrontation. Burrows lingered longest, his eyes burning with impotent fury, but eventually even he wheeled his horse and rode away. Clara stood watching until the last of them disappeared over the ridge. Then she felt small arms wrap around her waist, and she looked down to find Nara gazing up at her with those wide, trusting eyes. "You stayed," Nara said. "I stayed," Clara agreed. Miri and Jindu joined the embrace, and then Maya and finally Karlan himself, his strong hand coming to rest on Clara's shoulder. "Welcome home," he said. Clara wept then, not tears of sorrow but of release, of joy, of a burden finally set down. She wept for the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. She wept for all the ways she had been broken and all the ways she was being made whole. Around her, the family held her steady. The morning sun climbed higher, the mist burned away, and Clara, surrounded by love she had never expected to find, understood at last what it meant to belong. Epilogue. The years that followed brought changes Clara could not have imagined. On that first terrible day at Willowbend Station, she became the community's teacher, gathering children from surrounding properties, Aboriginal and settler alike, to share the knowledge she had accumulated. Her classroom was the shade of a river-red gum, and her lessons wove together the learning of two worlds. Kaylin and Clara built a love that grew slowly, rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. It was not the passionate romance of storybooks, but something deeper, a partnership of equals who had chosen each other with open eyes and full hearts. Alice eventually left her father's house and came to visit, staying longer each time until she too became part of the extended family that had formed around the camp by the creek. She and Clara remained close until the end of their days. Country accepted Clara as it accepted all who came to it with open hearts. She learned its stories, its seasons, its sacred places. She learned to listen when the land spoke, and to tread gently upon its ancient bones. And when people asked her, in later years, how she had found her way to such an unlikely life, Clara would smile and say, "Freedom begins when someone finally sees who you truly are."